Good afternoon in Maastricht. My name is Tom van Veen. I'm acting pro-rector of this university. And hereby I open this academic ceremony in which Claudia Roethlisberger will defend the academic thesis Persistent Gender Gaps in Labour Market Outcomes, Essays on the Contribution of Personality Traits and Social Norms and the Effectiveness of a Policy Intervention. May I invite you, Claudia, to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis in 15 minutes.
Dear Pro-Rector, dear members of the Corona, dear supervisors, dear family and friends, welcome to the defense of my dissertation. My thesis is about persistent and pervasive gender gaps in labor market outcomes and the extent to which personality traits and social norms contribute to these outcomes and how effective a related policy intervention was to narrow the gaps. Across the OECD, gender gaps are persistent, with fewer women active in the labor market, much higher shares of women working part-time, and women considerably earning less. The gaps are also pervasive, as from career entry across industries and education levels, women fall behind, and gaps widen critically with family formation. This has fueled a strong sense of injustice. Traits and norms may provide insight into what holds women back by creating different opportunities and constraints. Women and men may differ in how they are. They may have different time constraints and responsibilities, or different opportunities for mobility and networking. Various policies have been implemented to promote female labor supply and enable parents to reconcile family and work. But the empirical evidence on the effectiveness of policy interventions remains mixed. That is why it is valuable to have more research. At the core of this thesis are the following concepts: labor supply, the gender wage gap, and the premise that increasing female labor supply is the main avenue for fostering gender equality in labor markets. For personality traits, I focused on the Big Five personality inventory, which is the most widely accepted self-reported personality scheme. For social norms, I focused on gender role attitudes to capture norms at the individual level and on a childcare policy to capture norms at the society level. The main research question that guides this dissertation is: to what extent do personality traits and social norms contribute to gender gaps in labor market outcomes, and how can policy interventions enhance female labor supply and foster gender equality? The 4 questions to answer my main question are: 1, what is the available evidence on the contribution of personality traits and social norms to the gender wage gap? 2, to which extent can personality traits explain the wage gap? 3, to which extent are attitudes on gender roles and gender equality associated with female labor supply? And 4, what was the impact of a policy of a subsidy program for after-school care on labor supply? I used Switzerland as the case study for the empirical chapters and drew mainly on the Swiss household panel. This is a longitudinal representative household survey. To answer sub-question 1, I conducted a systematic literature review to provide a comprehensive understanding of the available evidence on the contribution of traits and norms to the gender wage gap. I searched the literature in 2 of the largest research databases, EBSCO and the Web of Science, following the population intervention comparison and outcome criteria. This left me with 39 articles. I examined these articles according to a conceptual framework that documents how personality traits and social norms are operationalized, through which mechanisms they relate to the pay gap, and how much they contribute to explaining the gap or being a source of discrimination. According to these 39 articles, I found that traits and norms are both important in relation to the gender pay gap, and they are also interrelated. But there is no clear consensus on the constructs, what they precisely capture, and how to measure them. There is a great deal of heterogeneity in the results, with the contribution of traits and norms to the pay gap ranging from a few to more than 20%. The literature remains inconclusive on whether traits and norms rather explain or fuel the gap. A better understanding of these two factors is thus warranted. The thesis contributes with new evidence by answering sub-questions 2, 3, and 4. For sub-question 2, I estimated the contribution of the Big Five personality scheme to wages and the gender wage gap. I used a standard log linear earnings equation with my main independent variables being the Big Five dimensions. My dependent variable was the log of hourly wages. For the decomposition, I applied the Oaxaca blinder methodology, using assumptions about the non-discriminatory wage structure, different assumptions. What I found was that only one dimension, neuroticism, contributed to explaining wages. Higher levels of that trait exerted a wage penalty for women, but not for men. The decomposition results depended on the choice of the non-discriminatory wage structure, with neuroticism explaining up to 5 to 6% of the gap. But in no specification, personality traits were a source of discrimination. These results place a high responsibility on women. They suggest that women's higher level of neuroticism explain the wage penalty and not discrimination. But the results are at the lower end of the range found in the systematic literature review. To answer sub-question 3, I investigated the association between gender role attitudes and female labor supply. I hypothesized that women with more progressive attitudes are more likely to supply labor, and that the progressivity of the couple matters as well. I used panel data for 15 years to estimate a two-way fixed effects regression model. My main independent variables were the attitudes of women and the attitudes of the couple women live in. I looked at 4 different attitude variables. The dependent variable was the labor supply of women in terms of the extensive and the intensive margin. I found some evidence that women's own progressive attitudes on gender roles stimulate their labor supply, and this foremost at the extensive margin. But the attitudes of the couple showed hardly any association. This suggests that women themselves can boost gender equality by internalizing progressive attitudes and implementing these beliefs by pursuing and investing in their careers. But the associations also here were small and consistent only for one attitude variable. Progressive attitudes may thus not be sufficient to enable women to work and build a career. Their labor supply may depend more on supportive infrastructure. And this is at the heart of sub-question 4. Here, I analyzed the long-term effects of a subsidy program for after-school care on parental labor supply. In Switzerland, after-school care has not been a given. It has mainly been the responsibility of parents. That is why the Swiss government implemented a subsidy program to expand after-school care as of 2003. I assessed the impact of that program with a staggered difference in differences estimation and matching technique. I first created a treated and control group that are as similar as possible through propensity score matching. I then compared labor supply of mothers and fathers who lived in municipalities that received subsidies for after-school care with mothers and fathers who lived in municipalities that did not receive subsidies, either because they did not request or did not request yet these subsidies. I found that the subsidy program had no effect on participation rates, but increased the percentage of work of mothers and decreased that of fathers. I found that the program was primarily effective in municipalities that adopted the subsidies early, suggesting that effects needed time to materialize. The program may have contributed to boosting gender equality through reallocating unpaid work and labor supply within the household. And this brings me to the conclusion of the thesis. In terms of key findings and contributions, the thesis shows that personality traits and social norms contribute to understanding gender gaps in labor market outcomes. They affect productivity and opportunities of how women and men can engage in the labor market, often putting women at a disadvantage. The thesis provides new empirical evidence on associations and effects of traits and norms. It shows that associations and effects are rather small and limited to specific dimensions and circumstances. The thesis thus challenges the assertion that traits and norms are major drivers of gender inequalities or hold the key for large change. Yet the relationship should not be underestimated as norms and traits change slowly. It shows that foremost women's personality traits or attitudes are associated with labor market outcomes. This suggests that women themselves can foster more gender equality, but at the same time, the findings place a high responsibility on women, as I mentioned before. And the thesis extends knowledge for Switzerland, a country that is less covered in this area of research, but offers insights into which context women can thrive. In terms of policy recommendation, the thesis suggests that policy related to personality trait and social norms has limited scope to advance the quest for gender equality, but still there is some room. In terms of external factors, the thesis confirmed the importance of childcare policy to enable parents to reconcile family and work. It showed the need for longer-term perspectives as subsidies took time to materialize. The results question if programs should be phased out when demand is met of early adapters, or target subsidies at parents rather than municipalities, as the program was primarily effective for parents that were already working. In terms of internal factors, the thesis emphasizes the value of education and policies in support of women's progressive role in society. It also suggests that programs to mitigate high levels of neuroticism would be valuable to offset the trait that is penalized in the labor market, but that there is also a need for society to embrace different personalities. I want to end with some limitations and areas for future research. Endogeneity between norms, traits, labor supply, and wages is a limitation throughout the stream of literature. This thesis acknowledges the possibility of reverse causality in the studies that cannot address endogeneity explicitly, highlighting that results should be interpreted as associations rather than causality. Yet it also attempts to address causality specifically through the impact evaluation of the study program. It would be valuable to better understand why labor markets or society does not value more traits of which women tend to have higher levels and which also appear productive in the workplace such as agreeableness or conscientiousness. And there is a broader question. What is missing in understanding gender inequalities in labour market outcomes so that we can design better policies and ensure that gender equality is no longer an ambition, but a reality? With this, I thank you for your attention and would like to refer back to the Pro-Rector.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Goldstein, Professor of Human Capital and Social Economics at Maastricht University, and Professor Goldstein was chair of the assessment committee of this thesis.
Thank you very much, dear candidate, dear Claudia. First of all, congratulations on finishing the thesis. It's a job well done. It contains chapters on the extent to which personality traits and social norms can explain the gender wage gap and if subsidies for after-school care can affect labor supply, as you just explained. I think in all chapters you use very rich and interesting Swiss data. You also show that you are very knowledgeable of the literature, especially in chapter 2, but also in the other chapters. My questions are in chapter 5, and I apologize for, I'm the first to ask a question, but they are quite technical, rather technical in nature. I hope you can take that. So in this chapter, you analyze whether a subsidy for after-school care affects labor supply of men and women. You use the difference in difference technique to analyze this question, comparing labor market outcomes for mothers and fathers who live in communities whose requests for subsidies for after-school care were approved, with mothers and fathers who live in communities which have not requested such subsidies or whose requests were not approved yet. I have 2 questions about this. So my first question is about the common trends. So commonly in difference in differences techniques, you show a common trend. And the technique hinges on this assumption that these trends in the outcome variable between treatment and control group would have remained the same if the treatment had not happened. So if the trends are common, the assumption is more convincing. And my question is, why did you not show this commonality in the trends? So I see that you use inverse probability weighting to make the treatment and control groups more alike, but I still would have liked to have seen the trends. So this is the question, whether you looked into it and whether you can say something more about that. But before you start answering that question, let me also pose the second question. Okay. And that's really rather specific. It's on page 118 in your book. Yes, so you have a model there which shows your staggered difference in differences design, but I don't fully understand the notation, I think. So maybe you can explain that a bit better. So that's about 2 variables, the D, and DXC, and T, TXCT. So about DXC, that is a treatment dummy, which is 1 if a municipality was treated with subsidies at some point in time. But if I understand correctly, the municipality may be in the control group at one point in time and in the treatment group at another point in time, because it's a staggered difference in differences. So this makes this computation of the inverse probability weighting more complex, and that's what I would like you to explain to me, how you see this. And then about T, that is a time dummy that is equal to 1 from the year onwards that a municipality received subsidies for after-school care. But T also has to become 1 for the control group at some point in time. Otherwise, you can't run the difference in differences model. It has to be both 0 and 1 for the control group and for the treatment group. So I think I didn't understand this notation, and I hope that you can explain this to me, how this model works. Those are my 2 questions. Thank you.
Okay. So, highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and questions. I would like to start with your second questions in explaining more the model. So, as you said, I am using D for the time. It takes the value of 1. If a municipality received the subsidies at one point in time, yes. And I use T from the year onwards that a municipality received the subsidies. So what I am interested in is the coefficient of beta 3. That is the multiplication of these two. So what I do is I look at different time periods. I look at the early adapters. I look at the peak adapters, and I look at the late adapters. So I can distinguish between the effects across these 3 periods of time.
So there is a group that never takes that is the control group. That is the control group never receives the subsidy, or can it be that in the?
It depends.
Oh yeah. Okay, that's what I was thinking.
Okay. Excuse me. Thank you for the specification. So I always compare in the control group are always the municipalities that have not received yet the treatment. So either because they never ask for the subsidies, or they have not received them yet.
Right.
So it depends. And but I can, with the staggered differences technique, I can account for the specific year that the municipality received the treatment.
Right. So the inverse probability weighting also differs across years. It's not it's not constant across time.
Yeah. So I use the inverse probability rates for the matching, and I'm using that before the start of the program.
Right. Right. But then the control and treatment group are they are before the program ever started. That's where you design the weights, but you just said that the control and treatment group can change across time. So that's my confusion. So if these weights could also change across time.
Yeah. So it depends which municipalities are included. So I have a baseline with the municipalities that were there at the beginning, and I create a control and treated group.
Right.
And then the methodology I have, as it's a staggered differences estimation technique, it looks at the exact year when the municipality received the treatment.
Yeah. Yeah, and then it becomes treatment group. So at that point you design the inverse probability weighting.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Then I understand that. Yeah. And but that t as a time that is never 1 for the control group. That is a wrong reading of. I read this the wrong way, or because it also has to become 1 for the control group at some point, right?
For the treatment, for the T.
Yes.
Now, the municipalities that are never treated, that never receive the subsidies, they enter as 0.
For T, so not D. For T, that's a time. So time should also become 1 at some point for the control group. Otherwise, it's a constant instead of you can't run the interaction.
Yeah, in the interaction, yeah, I then have the municipalities that receive the treatment at some point in time.
Maybe we can have the discussion afterwards and go to the second question.
Yeah, but you already made it a lot clearer. Thank you very much for your answer.
You can go to the other question maybe, because you had two questions, or are they both?
Oh, like that? Yeah. No, so I think it's related, but
okay.
So if you could shed light on that still, on my first question. So why you didn't show this commonality in the trend?
With the parallel trend, the
Yes.
assumption of the parallel trend. Yeah. So I focused my analysis in that chapter on the matching, and I was using the Hotelling test and also the figure that shows the propensity scores before and after the matching, to show that the technique was successful in creating a control group, a treated and control group that are very similar in their characteristics.
Yes. So, but if they are similar, then you could have just shown the. I think you don't need a difference in differences anymore. Basically, you could also have controlled for these variables and then run the regression of the treatment and show the treatment on the outcome, right? So I think that's basically not necessary anymore.
It's something that I would need to look more into, but the technique depended on the municipalities receiving the treatment and comparing them to those who have not received the treatment at any point in time.
Yeah, I see.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Yes.
Okay,
thanks a lot.
So the opposition will be continued by Professor Schwieren, Professor of Organizational Behavior, University of Heidelberg.
Dear candidate,
Professor Schwieren was member of the assessment committee.
Dear candidate, first of all, also from my side, congratulations for a very nice thesis on a very important and unfortunately still relevant and timely topic, even though we are dealing with this topic now for ages. And I think you brought a very interesting and nice focus on that by not just focusing on policies, etc., but on a very specific thing, personality traits and social norms. And then also discussing what type of policy interventions actually could tackle these things. But so I'm now switching from a very detailed question to a very high-level question, kind of looking more at the overarching theme and ideas of your thesis. So I also refer to some of your propositions. And I also have two questions that are strongly interrelated. So first of all, in your first chapters, like chapters 2 and 3, and also in your propositions 2 and 3, you're saying the personality traits, on one hand, you say they are not a source of discrimination in Switzerland. But then you say women are penalized for specific personality traits. And I was wondering, so how could actually personality traits be a source of discrimination? First thing. And then if they are somehow detected and being penalized, what actually can we do against this? And you had this in your thesis again, that we should somehow use policies that tackle women's higher neuroticism. Well, how actually could you use a policy to change neuroticism in women? And my second question then relates very much to one thing you said a couple of times in your presentation as well, that your results put a high responsibility on women. But then you have this nice graph on the title that actually shows they are facing different ladders than men. So why should we put the responsibility of women? What happens if we do that? I mean, you're saying actually in your thesis at some point that women might rationally choose not to go the career track because anticipating that it would not work out well for them. So maybe they actually rationally do that because it doesn't do any good for them. So why put the responsibility on women and not on the ladder? And yeah, that's it. I stop here.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and questions. This is a question that also within our team or with my supervisor we have been discussing quite a bit. And my answer to that question is that the result on the discrimination, that personality traits and especially neuroticism is linked to, or whether or not it's linked to discrimination depends on the definition. And in chapter 3, what I am using is the Oaxaca blinder decomposition methodology, which decomposes wages into a share or a part that is explained by differences in endowments and a share that is that remains unexplained or is driven by differences in rewards. And it's that last part that would be a reflection of discrimination. So applying this methodology, I do not find that in the case of Switzerland, personality traits are the source of discrimination because the results suggest it's women's higher level of neuroticism that explain the wage gap. When I mention that it places a high responsibility on women, I mean that the results may make it appear as it's the responsibility of women. I think what is important to highlight here that there is also a responsibility for society to embrace different personalities and that we may need to think about neuroticism in a different way. In terms of discrimination, if we take a broader definition, such as an unequal treatment of people or a person that are otherwise equal, the results would suggest, yes, that there is discrimination. But according to the Oaxaca blinder decomposition methodology, I do not find evidence that there are differences in rewards to these personalities. And then the question of what could be done, I argue that the training programs could support women in dealing better with that trait that is penalized in the labor market. So I could imagine that this can have to do with how much do we worry or how stressed do we get? Can we remain calm? And I would think that there are different strategies, also drawing from psychology, of how to deal with these situations and lower the levels of society, of that personality trait. But once again, I would like to emphasize that it is important that also society has a share, and we need to think about how to embrace different personalities.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Plantinga, professor in economics of the welfare state at Utrecht University, and Professor Plantinga was also a member of the assessment committee of this thesis.
Dear candidate, you've written an interesting book on an intriguing and indeed persistent issue, gender gaps in labor market outcomes. The book is well structured and well written, and in 5 chapters we learn about the possible contribution of personality traits and social norms in this respect, examining the case of Switzerland. And as a kind of extra, as a kind of bonus, we have a final chapter investigating the effect of a subsidy program for after-school care on parental labor supply. And what I also like about the manuscript is your positive inclination. The result may be modest, yet you emphasize they are important. For example, on page 141, you state that the overall finding of small and limited effects should not be, and I quote, underestimated as norms and traits change slowly, and the small effects can become important in the long run. And so it is. Now, my question refers, and this is kindly following up on my earlier question, my question refers to chapter 3. The chapter focuses on personality traits and the contribution to the gender wage gap, and there is indeed a small and limited effect. Statistical significant associations are limited to one dimension, neuroticism, and not only for women. Thinking about this, I did not find the results extremely surprising. After all, in the full model, you correct for job characteristics, including occupations. And it's quite likely that there's some association with personality traits here. At least I hope that my dentist is fairly conscientious. and I hope that healthcare personnel scores high on agreeableness, right? So now you came up with that association yourself in an analysis of subgroups in page 77. But there you distinguish occupations by skill level. And I don't know if that makes so much sense, because it's not about the level, it's about the nature of the job. And in your discussion sector, you also suggest that people might self-select into occupations according to their personality. So, according to their personality, they self-select into different roles in different occupations. Now, thinking about this further, the significant score of neuroticism also somehow seemed to make sense. I have been working with the Big Five before, and as an economist, I always was a bit puzzled about its exact composition. Because in economic life, openness to experience, conscientiousness, extraversion, and agreeableness are somehow useful in different roles in academic life, in economic life. But neuroticism further explains as being emotional, temperamental, and anxiousness. That seems a burden in professional life. So there's no association here with the, occupational structure. Yet, from my perspective, I would say it's especially a burden for men. And your research, however, indicates a significant association only for women. So my questions are, can you expand a little bit on the association between personality traits and associations? What's your intuition on this? And if you had perfect data, how would you deal with this matter? And how about this neuroticism? Why is it only women for women significant, and why have women high levels? If I look at the current political climate, I see, well, you can feel, yeah, okay, so I won't expand on that. But nevertheless, weren't you a little bit disappointed by the result? And for example, didn't you research how it is actually measured? Isn't that also perhaps a reason for this particular result? So these are a few questions behind your actual outcome of chapter 3.
Thank you very much, highly esteemed opponent, for your compliments and question. Could I ask you to repeat the first part of the question? I had the second and the third.
The first is to expand a little bit, or to give us a little bit more understanding of the association, I think, between personality traits and occupations. Because you control for occupations, somehow you seem to have the same intuition that there's something going on there, and that people self-select into occupations according to their personality traits. But yeah, there is a robustness check, but only on levels, and not on the nature of the work. So if you had perfect data, how would you go along?
Okay. Yes. So for that first part of the question, I would have been very interested in looking deeper into occupations, but the data structure did not allow a more granular level than what I had. And what was a challenge there also is that the same level of occupation following the classification of the ILO may have very different types of occupations. For instance, a level 3, according to the occupations, could be a teacher, which one would think requires a high level of the social facets of personality traits, but it could also be an IT expert, which may have less need for these sort of facets. So there are some limitations in the classification of occupation that did not allow me to go deeper. The fact that neuroticism was only associated with women's labor market outcomes suggests that the labor market may scrutinize more women's traits than men's. Men may have more liberty in who they are in the labor market, but they may also have fewer choices in terms of their percentage of work. In Switzerland, most men continue to work full-time, and there's a much higher share of women that work part-time. But the results of the analysis suggest that women are more under scrutiny in the labor market, and I think that's also an interesting takeaway from that analysis. And in terms of how it is measured, so I am using the self-reported scheme. In the literature, there are self-reported big 5 schemes that are very short and some that are much longer. In the area of economics, I have taken from the literature that also the short schemes that these are valid schemes. But the literature also acknowledges that there is some degree of variation, as a person may self-report their agreeableness different at work than at home. But overall, the scheme has been widely tested and is recognized as a scheme that can be used in economic analysis as well. So I would argue that the analysis based on the big 5 short inventory, it is useful, but we have to be well aware also of the limitations of that scheme.
Just one, if I may, just one follow-up question.
A short one, yes.
Your data are from 2015, right?
Yes, correct.
And especially over the last decade, a movement as Me Too gained momentum.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of debate about social safety. So what's your intuition on this? If you would measure it again, that perhaps there would be also higher levels or a larger penalty on neuroticism also when it comes to men?
I would have loved to have to also look into data, especially after COVID, to also see how that has had an impact, as it has shifted roles also within the household. But unfortunately, such data were not available, and we considered that it was an unprecedented shock to labor markets, that it would have brought a whole new set of restrictions to the analysis. But I could imagine, yes, that with the Me Too movement and maybe also the backlash on gender, I think that's another important point in that area, that the self-evaluation of neuroticism has also changed, or seeing other very, very public figures of how of how strongly they can express their emotions and do not seem to remain calm may have an impact also on how we value that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Kuhn. Dr. Kuhn is Associate Professor at the Research Center for Education and the Labour Market at Maastricht University, and Dr. Kuhn was member of the assessment committee of the thesis.
Thank you. Dear candidate, first of all, I also would like to congratulate you with your PhD thesis. Your thesis on a highly relevant topic nicely contributes to the literature on gender gaps in labour market outcomes. It was a pleasure to read the different chapters. And throughout your thesis, you clearly show, based on merely correlational evidence, the important role of gender norms in gender gaps. In your last chapter, you analyzed the effect of a policy intervention on the gender gap in terms of employment decisions on the extensive and intensive margins. And I was wondering whether you could have made use of this specific policy intervention to also provide causal evidence on the importance of gender norms, in both explaining gender gaps, but also to provide policymakers clear suggestions on how to change gender norms. So I would like to ask you to think about this possibility. Have you thought about this? Did you consider it? And if not, how would you go about if you would go into this direction?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and questions. I am not sure to have fully understood the question. If you may repeat, please.
Yes, of course. Yeah. So in your last chapter, yeah, you analyzed the effect of a policy change, yeah, on the intensive and extensive margin for both men and women. And I was wondering if you could also use this intervention to see what happens with gender norms. And if you could have used that also as an explanation of why specific labour market gaps change, and yeah, how you would go about such a research.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it would have been, yeah, interesting to see how increasing labour supply through or thanks to the subsidy program, of how that has translated into, or whether it has translated into changing norms. If I understand correctly, that's your question of how I would go, about that. So it would be inversing, you know, the dependent variable of explaining the attitudes, for example. What I found in that chapter is that there is an increase of female labour supply and a decrease of male labour supply. I assume that to some extent this is what it was happening within the household. So it may have indeed triggered a shift in the allocation of unpaid labour and the labour supply in the household. And that could be followed up. It would be interesting to have the same respondents to see how they respond on the questions on gender role attitudes that are, for instance, also in the Swiss household panel. So to be able to follow and see a few years later of how they would report on these gender role attitude variables. I think that would be an interesting addition to that analysis.
Okay, thank you. I think there's very interesting research around at the moment that indeed looks at different reforms in parental or paternity leave even, and they look at the effects on gender norms of the children that were just or not just affected by these policies. I think it would be a very nice addition and might explain your results in your last chapter.
Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Dr. Nieme. Dr. Nieme is Associate Professor at the UMU Merit Institute of Maastricht University.
Thank you. Dear candidate, dear Claudia, I would like to also add my voice to my colleagues. It was a very interesting thesis to read. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot and gave a lot of food for thought. So I also congratulate you on very nice writing style and also very organized and made it very easy to read. So congratulations. I have two questions. My first question, and your answer can be very simple to that, relates a little bit with, relates to chapter 4. And it's about the selection bias and sample limitations. While you discuss more in depth in some of your chapters than others, I would be interested to learn more about what do you think the impact of excluding women who are not in the labor force have had on the findings, and what do you think this selection bias, in what way do you think the selection bias may have influenced your results? So that's my first question. If you want to answer, then I can go ahead for my second.
Okay. Yeah. Esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and question. So how I dealt with selection bias in that chapter is by distinguishing the analysis by the extensive and the intensive margin. So I first look at the decision to work and then at how much to work. So they are subsequent, and that allows me that I would not need to impute a wage to women. In that case, I only look at women that are not working. So that is the strategy of how I'm dealing with the selection bias issue. And in the literature, I think it's inconclusive on whether imputing a wage for the non-working of how reasonable or how good an assumption that is.
Okay, this is good. My second question is maybe much more related to policy and also how do we think for the way forward, because also some of the questions that were asked prior about the responsibility of women and mainly the area of social norms. So I'm not going to be talking about personality traits, but the shifts in gender roles and attitudes over time across cultures, you've talked about that, and you talked about how the effects of this. But if we look at what's going on today, and a lot of this new emergence of more traditional social norms, and here I'm very interested in what we see with this, what we call the trad wives movement in Europe, which is this romanticizing about traditional roles, that the woman's place is at home, the male is the provider, which is actually being really pushed forward in a lot of social media. You have, here they call it the Gen Z and millennial housewives practicing the stay-at-home girlfriends movement, right? Promoting this patriarchal relationship versus what we have been saying all along, women participating in the labor market. Now, going back to this idea of the responsibility of women, I'm actually very curious about your reflection on the broader changes in societal norms that we're seeing, because, you know, I think, as was mentioned, when we think about it, in the past, we had assumed we want to progress towards more gender equality, and as you said, the responsibility of women. So if the women are coming back and saying, wait a second, who said we wanted to participate in the labor? Who said we wanted inequality? Our agency is to be at home. How do you think this would reflect or should be reflected among policy discussions? Also considering a lot of the political environment that we are seeing at the moment. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I also found in the data in the Swiss Household Panel that there is a certain reversal of progressive views in the last part of the data that was available. I think that very much reflects that trend, that it's a fallacy to think that a society always wants to become more progressive, that there are also parts of society that appreciate more traditional role models. And that's what I see in the data in Switzerland. So for instance, also for chapter 5, it would to think about the effectiveness of that policy. I think we also need to think about what was the objective. It was not necessarily to bring more women into the labor market. It was to enable mothers and fathers to better combine work and family. And I think that is also why we see that the policy was effective for those already working. It did not bring new women into or additional women into the labor market, and that may reflect the policy objective that that was set with the after-school subsidy program. The results in both of these chapters, I think they reflect that there is change. We talked about before also the backlash, that not everybody agrees that women should have more progressive roles in society. But I would think if we are committed to a world of more gender equality, we need to keep that on the international and national policy agendas. But it's an important discussion to have, to which extent we can then adjust policy to also reach that goal.
Can I do a follow-up?
Yes, you can do a small follow-up question.
And I mean, and I agree with you, but I am a bit, and one of the things I really liked in what you wrote also about for the future generation, this is something that really concerns me. So we're actually looking at results from Switzerland. You're not looking at a result from maybe other contextual countries where you would say, okay, women still need to work on being included in the labor market. And the thing is that if international organizations, and there's a huge effort about pushing the inequality agenda towards more women engagement in the labor force. But when we see results like this, and as you said in the data, coming from Europe, and we see movements about more traditional roles for women, my question to you, how would you actually phrase this discussion of pushing for more policy in context where they are already much less prone to engaging women? Yet we are telling them they should engage women, but we see in Europe this regression. How would you, as a policymaker, consolidate that?
Now, I must say you may finish your sentence, but you haven't started, so
We can leave that till
we'll stop here.
Okay.
Claudia Roethlisberger, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and not. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Hit the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and not. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and not. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Claudia Roethlisberger, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Gassman is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Claudia Roethlisberger, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Professor Groot will do the laudatio now.
Dear Dr. Roethlisberger, dear Claudia, it's a great honor and privilege to be the first to congratulate you with your doctorate degree. I also do this on behalf of Francisca and Bruno. We all three feel very proud about what you have achieved. You have written an excellent dissertation that increases our knowledge and insight on gender inequality in the labor market and interventions to close the gender gap. Your dissertation shows that gender inequality in wages and labor supply are not only rooted in difficult to change social norms about paid labor and the care for children, but also, probably even more difficult to change, in differences in personality traits that men and women possess. It also shows that after-school care mainly benefits women who are already active in the labor market. For them, it reduces the gender gap. It, however, does little to stimulate women to enter the labor market and thus increases the gap between working and non-working women with children. Gender inequalities are a topic of fierce debate. We saw some evidence of that already during the opposition this afternoon. We had these discussions as well, both among ourselves and with the reviewers of your work. I want to highlight two examples. The first is about the systematic literature review, which was published in a high-ranked journal, the Journal of Economic Surveys. The journal asked 3 people to review the paper. One of them, apparently a feminist economist, was very skeptical about what we had done. I want to read out one comment from the second round of comments that this reviewer sent us. I quote, "I will try one more time. What empirical evidence gives us is the difference in means between men and women's distributions. But sloppy reporting leads to people confusing the average of the women's scores with the scores of the average woman, which in turn fits easily in social influence stereotyped ideas about the typical or the normal woman." The reviewer has a point here, of course. There are no typical women, as there are no typical men. One of the attractions in life is that we're all different, and you typify that. You're anything but typical or ordinary. You studied in Lausanne, Singapore, London, and Sevilla, and had a varied international careers with stays in Nepal and Santiago de Chile. You also managed to complete your dissertation within 4 years' time, alongside your very busy job at UNCTAD and your considerable family responsibilities. This is something that even PhD candidates who are able to work full-time on their dissertation usually find hard to accomplish. So far, one paper has been published in a top economics journal, as despite the controversy, the review study was published last year and has attracted already quite some attention, as evidenced by the number of citations it has received so far. I hope and expect that the other 3 papers will be published in good journals soon as well. We certainly hope to continue our collaboration with you on that. The other example I wanted to mention is the debate we had among the 4 of us about the impact of neuroticism on the gender gap as well. It's an intriguing topic because it came up repeatedly during your defense as well. Your study shows that for both women and men, neuroticism has a negative effect on wages. However, women score higher on the neuroticism scale than men, and consequently, they're penalized more. This made you conclude that women themselves could reduce the gender gap by becoming less neurotic. Consequently, one of your recommendations is that programs for women to mitigate their high levels of neuroticism could offset the negative effects of this personality trait in the labor market. I think that both Franziska and Bruno and I were quite skeptical about this recommendation. Do you want to advocate that governments initiate mental health programs to change women's personalities and put them all through the same mold? Despite our objections, you stood your ground and kept it in the conclusions of your dissertation. And you also defended it adequately during the defense. This says something about who you are. You're open to others' arguments of others, but you're also self-confident and stand by your convictions. If you stick for a moment with the personality traits, I would say that you're stable and relaxed. You're a perfectionist as well. Totally the opposite, therefore, of being neurotic. I've looked it up, and neuroticism shows itself in people being anxious, dissatisfied, emotionally unstable, stressed, and withdrawn. You're totally the opposite in everything of that. The amateur psychologist in me says, you want to grant all women what you have. I think it's no coincidence that you end your short bio-sketch in your dissertation by writing that you and your husband are committed to transmitting to your children the value of equality, lifelong learning, and perseverance. You want others to share the good things in life that you've benefited from. Perseverance is something you also have in abundance. You're very well organized. Not many people manage to write an excellent dissertation within 4 years' time, especially as you had to navigate our sometimes slightly diverging views on how to proceed with the study. Finally, let me again congratulate you, Dr. Roethlisberger, with your excellent achievement, also on behalf of Franziska and Bruno. I also want to take the opportunity to thank the members of the assessment committee for their efforts and work in evaluating your thesis and in providing opposition here today. I also want to extend our congratulations to your husband and your children and everyone else here and those who've taken the time to watch the live stream and virtually celebrate this joyful event with you here today.
Okay.
Dear Dr. Roethlisberger, also on behalf of Maastricht University and the School of Business and Economics, I congratulate you with the degree that you have acquired. And herewith I close this session. The reception will be in the rafter afterwards, and we go to the stairs to make the famous photo.
Thank you.